grateful for having you here, and I'll hand over to you to say a few words.
Well, thank you very much, Adam, and it's lovely to follow Abigail and hear about the excellent things that are happening in Leeds. I'll look at the overall national issue, and I will apologise in advance. There may be some very loud ringing noises in the background in a second, which isn't a fire alarm. It means there's a vote going on, and I'll do a bit of juggle and probably keep talking and vote at the same time because, you know, multitasking is one of my specialities as an old journalist. But I'm going to focus on the national situation, and we are coming up to a really crucial point. Many people on this call, probably all, I'm sure, are aware of the Dimbleby report, which, although I'd still like it to have gone further in some areas, really did produce a powerful new vision of a different kind of food system. And one of the things that's often said is, oh, well, you know, England doesn't have a food strategy. Scotland is on their third version of such. Wales, I think, is well into their first and on the way to their second. But England has never had a food strategy that's written down. What we actually have had, of course, is the fact that the strategy has been, we'll let the supermarkets and multinational companies decide what we get to eat. And that's a product of a situation where the market's been allowed to reign, and what we've got from that is a situation where so many people are reliant on food banks, are really struggling to survive. But also we have huge problems with obesity, an extremely unhealthy diet, a huge shortage of vegetables and fruit in the diet. Now what we need actually is decent diets that people are actually able to afford. One of the things that's really interesting, that people might recall the horse meat scandal of quite a few years ago now, that uncovered the fact that in the UK we eat twice as many ready meals on average as the rest of Europe does. Of course, we also have the second longest working hours in Europe. We have double the average commuting time as the rest of Europe. And people really struggle to have the time and the money to actually eat well. We also, if you look on a global scale, and the UK is very different to this, more than 50% of our calories come from just 3 crops. And as we're seeing with the tragic, awful situation in Ukraine at the moment, which is going to have impacts, people are really only starting to think about it, on food security. We really, you know, it's deeply dangerous to rely on such a narrow variety of crops, and it's also terrible for our health. So what we really need is a different kind of food system, a food strategy that absolutely prioritises, as Abigail was saying, the local, that's for security. That's also, the government has a levelling up strategy. I'd much prefer to talk about a strategy for ensuring that we have prosperity, spreading out prosperity all around the land. That's what I'd really like to see. And so, you know, if we had strong local food systems in every city, a ring of market gardens around each town and city, making sure that we can grow plenty of food locally, and, you know, the money stays locally, and if we're still lucky enough to still have a local greengrocer, you know, she will, when she needs some new shelves, she'll employ a local carpenter. When she needs a new sign, a local sign writer. You might need an accountant, a solicitor, all of those kind of things. These are things that create prosperity in every community in the land, that give us food security, and also, of course, provide huge numbers of opportunities for small independent businesses. So what we have is a different kind of model of a food system, one that's not based around the food, around the supermarkets. So that's, you know, a kind of vision of how things can be different. Something else that I think is worth mentioning, and it's interesting, I've been in the House of Lords for about 2 years, and one of the first written questions that I ever put down was to a question about what the government was doing through government procurement. And, you know, about 10% of calories that are consumed in the UK are through hospitals, prisons, schools, etc., government procurement. And the answer I got back then was, oh, we don't keep those figures centrally, that's not something we think about, basically, you know, it's all relying on the market. Well, what we've got now is a situation where we need different kinds of things, and we need a system where we're ensuring healthy food for people, getting local supplies. And I'm quite interested that the last time I asked the Minister this question, I actually thought the Minister had stumbled, and he said, no, we're definitely looking at government procurement, looking to ensure that we buy more healthy local food. But when I followed this up with a written question, I got yes, this is something we're definitely going to look at in the food strategy. So we're seeing real change here, real opportunities. And I think it's really great that what you're doing in Leeds is setting up models of different ways of doing things. And that's absolutely crucial and something we really need to look forward to. So I wanted to say, you know, really This is why I've joined you today, even though I've had to kind of jam this into the day, because I think it is so important that people can see there are other ways of doing things. I still get, when I talk to the government, they sort of go, well, we have to rely on the supermarkets to supply food. In fact, recently, I think when there was talk about food security, and Boris Johnson said, oh, that's not my business, that's for the supermarkets. But really, what can be more central to a government role to making sure people do not go hungry, making sure there is adequate food supplies? That has to be, I would argue, a government responsibility, something that is taken up as a concern to set up policies that ensure that we can have small businesses, market gardens, growing vegetables and fruit has to be the foundation. And in a deeply insecure world, the far more we can do of that in the UK, and the Centre for Alternative Technology in Wales has actually done work that says we can be essentially self-sufficient in food. This is all possible and doable. What we have to do is get away from the idea that we depend on the supermarkets to decide how we eat, because that very clearly has worked out very badly. Thank you very much. I'm just going to stop for a second because I need to do a vote, but I'll come back in 1 second.
Is it worthwhile with... Natalie's back. No. I was just thinking, is it worth us quickly zooming around and doing our introductions while we're waiting for Natalie to come back? No. Okay. If I say a name...
Sorry, I'm now back. Apologies for that. That's a very fast voting procedure. Just my phone didn't want to handle the bandwidth for two things at once, unfortunately.
Has anyone got... Firstly, thank you very much for that, Natalie, for giving the bit of a national perspective on some really important themes. And we'll give Natalie a thank you for that. Has anyone got any questions or comments? I can see Pete from Hyde Park Source, first of all. Pete.
I was just doing some clapping hands emojis.
Oh.
But thank you, Natalie. I thought that was really inspiring. Thank you.
Tom.
Yeah, I've got a question, if I may. I agree absolutely with everything you say, Natalie. Thank you. And it's really encouraging to know that there are people at national level doing this, and all the cities are, can really push ahead. And we're going different speeds, and we've all got our own ideas. But I think the challenge is the supermarkets, as you so rightly say. The government don't really appreciate that we need to find some alternative methods. We don't want to break the supermarket model, because a lot of what they're doing does work, but a lot of it doesn't as well. So what would you recommend? How do we go ahead? We've got two councillors with us today, and others are listening. How do we, what sort of things can we put in place that would allow us to do what you were saying in terms of getting the local seasonal food in, which sits alongside the supermarkets, that they're not going to start trying to price out of existence, where there's some kind of symbiotic relationship? Is there anything that you know of that you can share with us?
Well, I think one of the things I would say is there are some broken things about the current supermarket model, and one of them is the idea that you can have every product on the shelves all of the time, and particularly obviously with vegetables and fruit, that's a huge problem. It involves huge amounts of wastage, everywhere from the farm, on the farm field, all the way through. If you have something on the shelf every hour of every day, every week of every year, there's a huge amount of wastage built into that system, so we need to get away from that. But where I would say is we need to really, and where local activity can make a difference, is I actually know a Green Party member down in the southwest whose family for many years had been potato growers, and there was 3 different packing sheds around their town where their potatoes went to. And then there was 3 packing sheds, and then there was 2 packing sheds, and then there was 1 packing shed, and then there was no packing shed, and they're now an organic dairy farmer, because without the packing shed. So what I think local government can really take a space in is look at both using procurement that might be under your control to secure that's one distribution system, to really think about the distribution systems. And also, one of the huge issues is access to land. There's huge numbers of people who would love to set up businesses to more growers, but often land is just massively, prohibitively expensive. We've really got to think about ways in which people can get access to land. And anyone who wants to see what's possible, there's a brilliant book called Miraculous Abundance, which is based on a very small bio-intensive growing of vegetables and fruit in France. And even on 1,000 square metres, you can produce an enormous amount of food. We've got to think about things like allotments and think about how they might become much more part of the system rather than an individualised thing where people aren't allowed to sell. How do we change that? So I think key things that could happen at the local level are that access to land and distribution systems and ways for people to actually get that food around and places to sell it. So it's all of those steps of the market process. And there are things like farmers markets and that, but the problem is very often they're very targeted at a relatively small, middle class, expensive. Another excellent example is Organic Lee, which is based in an old tree nursery in Chingford in North London. And, they explicitly didn't set up an organic box scheme. They set up an organic bag scheme, looking at smaller, cheaper provision into relatively poor council estates. So, all of these things can be done, and there's good models all around. But thinking about each step of the process is how are people able to grow? And then, there's nothing absolutely terrible about prepare food. Like, when you've got a huge glut of blackberries, how can you produce the year's blackberry jam for the city in one go through small independent enterprises, etc. All of these things are possible, that you can set up and happen locally, and can be a real feature for your city, for your community.
Lovely, thank you very much. Look up that bag scheme. I like that. Yeah.
I like the sound of the bag scheme. Any more questions for Natalie? Anne.
Will come in. On the Climate Emergency Advisory Committee, one of our working groups has had a presentation on vertical growing, and I wonder whether you've got anything you'd like to sort of talk about that. Especially we're thinking about, with being a city, we obviously have a bit more limited land than rural areas, but I wonder whether you've got any thoughts on that.
I think, for anyone who doesn't know, my first degree is agricultural science, and I can get terribly geeky about soils. And soils are a most amazing resource that produce the nutrients, if managed properly, the kind of wealth to produce very healthy food very easily. If you're talking about vertical growing, where you're looking at things like hydroponics, you're looking at things where, different kinds of systems, they have their place. The idea that this is some kind of total solution for our food situation, I would say, is not true. But I think, one of the things to look at is, obviously, if you've got any dark caverns sitting around anywhere, possibly some disused car parks, underground car parks, for example, mushrooms are an amazing, healthy, very useful crop for those kind of situations. Where you've got the existing structures, then I think vertical growing definitely has a place. And, you can also find this, people who have who live in flats who've got balconies. You can actually get quite an amazing amount of food stacked up, managed well on a balcony kind of thing. But sometimes you see this, right, what we'll do is we'll forget all about soil and everything, we'll just have this technology and we'll build this new building. When you start to do the carbon figures on that and also look at what you're producing and where your inputs come from, artificial fertiliser is a huge producer of greenhouse gases. We need to get away from artificial fertiliser. Natural systems that rely on organic matter, that rely on manure, although of course we also need to get away from factory farming, which could massively reduce the amount of manure that's around, which would be of great benefit to the quality of our rivers. So, the starting point is the ground, because that is the really amazingly easy way to grow vegetables, relying on biosystems that have developed over, tens of millions of years. We can't beat that with technology. But when you've got a specific space, if you've got a space you can't do anything else with, then you think this might be a good thing to do, or, a community group says, hey, we'd like to give this a go, then I'd say, let it go.
Okay, Penny first and then Caroline.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. Very inspiring to hear from you. I'm fully supportive of what you're saying. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about how we actually communicate some of those messages to the people who, most urgently need to make use of them, people in food poverty, fuel poverty, the fact that they survive on takeaways because they haven't got the confidence, they don't know how to cook. It's a massive education initiative that needs to go out there to help people to live more healthily and more sustainably?
I always start with the fact that there's just, as you rightly identified, Penny, so many systematic barriers. There may be lack of knowledge, there may be lack of equipment. One of the issues is, of course, yes, maybe, if you cook for your children a slow-cooked vegetable stew, but how much energy will that actually take? How much will that cost? Yeah. It's a very hard thing to calculate. And of course, if you're absolutely living right on the edge, one of your problems is if you cook that and the kids just refuse to eat it, then where are you? You can't just go and find something else. That's not an option that's available to you. So I always really want to focus on the system situation. But, this is where, public procurement, what happens in schools, things like growing, it's a really great thing to start with the children. And if you have, every school has a program for growing, radishes are a great example because they're really easy and really quick. If every school has a growing program, and kids will be interested in cooking something they've actually grown, and then interested in eating it and seeing what it tastes like, and they'll probably find it tastes far better than anything they expect from the supermarket. But there's a process there of giving people the opportunity and exposure without making them risk, because if you've bought something new and different and, your children really turn their noses up at it, if you're absolutely right on the edge, that's a huge problem and a risk it's really hard to take. But also the other thing is to look at, why is this ultra-processed pap so cheap? And it's because there's a massive amount of externalised costs. Plastic that it's wrapped in, that the manufacturer doesn't pay to dispose of, all the packaging, all the energy that went into producing that is not properly accounted for. So, if you actually rebalance the costs and ensure that the externalised costs are included in the prices of all foodstuffs, then you're in a situation where there's a much equaler balance and people have a more genuine choice. I'm always really careful about not waving fingers at people and saying you could do so much better, because actually under our current systems it's extraordinarily difficult to do much better in terms of a healthier diet.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, as a school governor, I'm also very conscious of the fact that all society's ills are heaped at schools to address, but feeding yourselves is a fundamental for me, but yeah.
Yeah, and one of the problems is schools are so pressured, to get exam results, to get SAT results. Abolishing SATs is an excellent food policy.
Thank you.
Caroline, did you have a question?
I just wanted to say to Al actually about the vertical growing. I just wanted to quickly say that I found there are some hybrid systems that use soil and hydroponics at the same time, and they're quite small at the moment, but they have potential. And I think, I agree with Natalie about it, that soil-based is best for nutrition and environmentally, but there are these hybrid ones where they use very nutritious soil with a flood bench, or also there's some experiments where they're using compost tea as the fertilizer. So it's just something to look out for, there is a kind of sort of hybrid way, maybe.
Can I just chip in a very quick thought there? The other thing about the vertical growing is that it can often be a way to open up new projects. I'll be mentioning it later, but in case you can't say, we've got one at the chapel right in the very middle of Leeds City Square, which Dorota is leading on. And they've actually got hydroponic growing inside the church now. And then they're putting raised beds outside the church and beehives on the roof. But it's a real kind of game changer because it's really unusual and unexpected. I think that's a very useful thing to do with hydroponics. But I agree absolutely about volume and about calories. We need to grow in the soil.
Right. Any more questions or comments for Natalie? If not, I know Natalie is very busy voting this afternoon. We can say thank you very much for taking time out of your very busy schedule this afternoon. Very much.
Thank you very much for having me and the great questions and discussion. I'm very sorry I can't stay for the rest of it, but I'm afraid it's just one of those days.